Okay, greetings class, and we're going to look today at continue our study of Parliament. We're going to look at the issue of how effectively does Parliament carry out its legislative function. How effective is Parliament as a legislature? So just by way of introduction, let's remind ourselves that Parliament has, we could say, 3 or 4 main roles. The 2 most important are its legislative role, its role in scrutinising the government or holding the government to account, representing the public, and in this role is debating important issues of the day. The most important of these, I would say, is its legislative function, its role as a legislature. Parliament ultimately is a law-making body. That's largely what it is. And so its legislative role, to be precise, is to debate and to, where necessary, amend and ultimately to either pass or reject government legislation. That is the main part of its legislative role, to debate, amend and either pass or reject government legislation. It also has a more secondary legislative role, which is that MPs also have some limited opportunities for putting forward legislation of their own. But most of the time, the legislation that Parliament debates and votes on will be government proposed legislation. Okay, so to give you an outline of this talk, I'm going to look first of all at the role of the House of Commons. This will fall into 2 parts. I'm going to look at the role that the House has as the first part of what I was talking about, dealing with government legislation, and then secondly I'm going to look at the House of Commons' role in actually initiating legislation, mainly through what are called private members' bills. And then third part of the talk will be looking at the role of the House of Lords. For each of these 3 sections I'll outline the processes involved, and therefore if the processes are working effectively, this is an argument that Parliament is carrying out its legislative role effectively. Then I'll look at some of the criticisms that can be made of the process that arguably render that role more ineffective. Okay, so first of all, before actually moving on to any of that, I just want to consider really what does it actually mean for Parliament to be carrying out its legislative function effectively. And really, there needs to be a kind of compromise here, because to carry out its function effectively, it can't mean simply passing everything the government puts before it unamended. Because arguably, if it were to do that, then there would be no point. The government may as well just give its bills straight to the Queen to sign into law, if Parliament's literally going to just approve everything the government puts before it without amendment. However, at the same time, if we imagine the opposite of that, then being an effective legislature probably also wouldn't mean blocking every single thing that the government puts before it either. So therefore, because a legislature that effectively never passed any legislation could certainly not be seen as effective. So an effective legislature, then, we can deduce would be one that passes legislation, yes, but whose support for government bills cannot be taken for granted, and is willing, a Parliament that's willing and able to stand up for the government where it deems it appropriate. Okay, so that aside, let's consider the arguments that Parliament is an effective legislature. First of all, let's look at the House of Commons. And the argument would be that the House of Commons does play an important role. First argument would be House of Commons does play an important role in debating and voting on government legislation. So, as we know, all government bills must pass through several stages of debate and voting in the House of Commons. So the first reading stage is not particularly important. It's literally just a government minister standing up and reading out literally the title of the bill, that's it. But during the second reading stage, the House of Commons get to vote on the bill for the first time. And they can reject a bill outright at this stage if they wish. Although, should be pointed out, this is rare, as government MPs certainly are generally reluctant to oppose a government bill outright in its entirety. The bill then moves on, if it's passed at the second reading, to the committee stage. The bill is usually at that stage examined by what's called a public bill committee, or occasionally by what's called a committee of the whole House, to which I'll come to in a moment. Now, a public bill committee is made up of backbench MPs, that is MPs without either ministerial or shadow ministerial positions. And they take evidence from expert witnesses in the field to help them understand the potential impact of the particular bill that they're looking at. So they'll scrutinize the bill in detail, and they'll literally vote whether to accept or amend or reject each line by line, each clause of the bill. They'll vote on and potentially amend separately, one by one. They'll then present their amended bill, if it is amended, back to the full House of Commons during what's called the report stage. They're reporting back, the committee's reporting back to the full House. The full House then get to debate and vote on the amended bill, and they get to propose further amendments of their own. Any MP at this stage, the report stage, can propose their own amendments to the bill. This is the first time in the process they actually get to propose amendments. Now, this stage is often particularly significant, as I said, government MPs will often be reluctant to oppose a government bill in its entirety, which is all they can do in the second reading, but they might be willing to put forward amendments, which they can do at the report stage. So this is what we've seen actually in the ongoing passage through Parliament of the EU withdrawal bill, is that rebel kind of anti-Brexit Tory MPs supported the bill at its second reading stage. They said, yeah, we support the bill, but then when it came to the committee stage and the report stage, they put forward amendments of their own, and the government was defeated on some of these amendments during that stage as a result of its own backbench MPs voting against it. We'll come onto that more later. So I said usually that's what happens at the committee stage. Usually it's this public bill committee, small group of backbench MPs looking at the bill line by line. However, occasionally a bill will be examined during the committee stage by what's called a committee of the whole House. Now, as you might imagine, as the name suggests, with a committee of the whole House, the committee stage is not carried out by a small group of MPs, but by the whole House of Commons, with all MPs able to participate in scrutinising the bill and proposing amendments at that stage. And this is how the Commons Committee stage worked with the EU withdrawal bill. So that didn't have a public bill committee looking into it. It was a committee of the whole House that looked at the EU withdrawal bill. And actually about 470 amendments were proposed at that stage. So to summarise where we've got to so far on the House of Commons role and the argument that the House of Commons is effective in its role in dealing with government legislation, we can see that the House of Commons can be seen as effective in that it does have the power to pass, reject or amend any proposed government legislation. And as I said, as we've seen with the amendments passed during the EU withdrawal bill, it is willing to use its power to inflict government defeats where it sees this as necessary. So far that's a good argument that Parliament is an effective legislature. It has the power to block or amend government legislation, and it is willing and able to use this on occasion. However, we should note here that government control of the House of Commons places major limits on the effectiveness of Parliament as a legislature. Now, this control comes from a combination of the government's inbuilt majority, which it normally has, doesn't have right at this moment, which is an important point, but normally a government will have an inbuilt majority in the Commons. That combined with its whips, the power of its whips, the so-called payroll vote, and the government's patronage powers, give the government in many ways effective control, or at least domination, of the House of Commons, which can limit Parliament's effectiveness. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So first point, as I say, the government of the day almost always has an inbuilt majority in the House of Commons. 16 of the last 19 general elections, the 19 general elections held since the end of the Second World War in this country, have returned single-party majority governments in which the governing party holds a majority of seats in the House of Commons. This means that so long as the government's own MPs vote in favour of any government proposals, the government is able to push through any legislation it likes. So the question is, how does the government make sure its own MPs, quote, toe the party line, that is, support its proposals? Well, first of all, it has the so-called payroll vote. There are usually around 100 MPs from the governing party who are actually members of the government with ministerial positions. That is to say, they're on the government's payroll. That's what's called the payroll vote. Now, remember the convention of collective responsibility, right? Remember that. And you might want to pause the video at this stage to remind yourself what is the convention of collective responsibility. Remember, this convention means all government ministers, all members of the government are obliged to publicly support government policy, which includes voting with the government in all votes in Parliament. If they don't want to do that, they have to resign from the government. So each time, what this means is each time the government puts forward a legislative proposal, it effectively has usually about 100 votes kind of guaranteed and in the bag from the start. So already that the payroll vote gives it a head start, if you like, when it's pushing its legislative proposals through the House of Commons. So that just leaves the government's backbench MPs. Remember, Conservative Party today, for example, I think has about 315 MPs. Only about 100 of them are officially members of the government, so it leaves about 200 plus backbench Tory MPs, who it also has to ensure vote for its proposals. Well, how does it do that? Well, firstly, of course, it has the party whips. Now, it's the job of the governing party's whips to make sure that backbench MPs support the government in parliamentary votes. And these whips have a reputation for using, to quote Malcolm X, any means necessary to achieve this outcome. There have been often reports of MPs leaving the whip's office in floods of tears. We can only guess what's been said to them. And the Conservative whips, in particular, became notorious for their use of the so-called Black Book. Now, this was said to be a book containing compromising personal information on as many Tory MPs as possible. And in fact, former Tory Chief Whip Tim Fortescue even admitted that the whips would effectively cover up criminal activities of MPs in order to win favours of them. But the whips do not have only threats and intimidation at their disposal. They can also dangle the prospect of government promotion to backbench MPs who they're worried might rebel. And this brings us to the government's patronage powers. So the Prime Minister has the power, as we know, to hire and fire all members of government, including cabinet ministers. So therefore, the prospect